There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the VTC Wilderness Medicine Journal Club. This is May 24, focusing on wildland fires. I just want to make one quick announcement. I have solved the connection Zoom issues, so that should not be a problem again like last month's last-minute cancellation. It was using the WMS Zoom account. If you don't log in about once a week, it forgets your computer. And then you have to get the PIN code sent to the WMS staff, but we've resolved that issue. I am now on that email registry, so I just get the PIN code immediately. So we are safe from there. I have finalized the schedule for the July to December series already, and I think we've got a cool event locked in for January even. So FOM credit submission has already been in, so it should all be approved as well for FOM credits, just like this session. So didn't want to belabor the point too much, but next month is the end of the current cycle, so expect the FOM certificates to come out end of June, maybe early July. So bear with me, but they're coming. Anyway, I'm going to introduce briefly our speakers, and then please feel free to further introduce yourselves as we go. So like I said, wildland fire is the topic of the month. We are joined by Dr. Michelle Curry, who's the medical director of the National Forest Service. And we have two students, Kyle Carr and Jameson. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, Grachi?
Yeah, it's good. It's all good.
Who are experiencing wildland fire as well. And they're joining us from Washington. So I'm going to, and Janelle, one of our VTC Wellness Medicine Fellows, is going to join in and help monitor the chat and stimulate with some questions. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Curry, who's going to start it off.
Oh, good evening, everybody from here on the East Coast. I'm not sure where everybody is, but I think most of us are on the East Coast. So Michelle Curry, background is emergency medicine for more years than you want to know about, and a little bit of previous military experience, then many years working with national disaster medical systems on deployments, remote austere medical care. And I came into the Forest Service after working for a year sabbatical in New Zealand. Which was quite cool, but that's another topic for another day. So tonight, I was asked to talk a little bit about wildland fire and EMS, and so I'm going to share a presentation with you all that I kind of call like an introduction into medical and what it looks like on a wildland fire. And I'm counting on Kyle and Jameson to keep me honest and keep me straight and chime in when I have it right and when I have it wrong. It is an environment that I did not grow up in, but have been rapidly schooled in over the last few years. So any insight they can give. So I am going to turn my camera off so you don't see my funny face while I pull up slides. And into presentation mode. Hang on. Almost there. Ta-da!
Yeah, it looks good.
All right, and you can still hear me.
Yes.
I'm gonna call that a win. I'm gonna call that a win. So, overview of wildland fire medical support. We call this the not so complete introduction. So just kind of the basics. So as you guys already mentioned, it's hitting kind of close to home for us on the East Coast. So before I moved to DC last summer, I was working remotely out of my home, which was in the Pisgah National Forest, right off the Blue Ridge Parkway, Linville Gorge area, for those of you who are familiar with that area. And this is a picture of Table Rock on fire. This was the fall of 2017. I actually watched this fire start. I was driving home from work and then continued to watch it as it got a little too close for comfort to my home. This is not my photo, but as a professional overview photo. And wildland fire pictures are always really, really pretty. It's totally different when you're on the ground, but the pictures are pretty. I can't get rid of this little wording in my screen, so hopefully you're not seeing it. So basically, the bottom line with wildland fires, it starts out complicated and it stays that way. That's pretty much it. It sort of depends on where the fire breaks out. It depends on shrink you guys, how big it gets and what types of lands are involved, whether they're private lands, state lands, Forest Service lands, or some other federal lands, tribal lands, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of drives the initial responding units. And then things get really crazy from there. It also tends to drive who pays for it, because wildland firefighting is expensive. And so when we talk about the funding source for all this stuff, it varies all over the place as well. And sometimes it's even shared. So it's important to note that it's not just the wild land anymore that is affected by wildland fire. So this is my house in November of 2017, and that is not fog. That is smoke, as that fire was burning not too far from where I lived. And after about, I don't know how the wildland firefighters sleep in this every day on their 14-day rolls, but they do. But after about a week, I had to leave. I just couldn't breathe anymore. This was my road to work. Again, not fog, but smoke. So how you get to it can be a challenge, in addition to it not being just the wild land. So it's a very complex area of operations. It's basically coordinated through the National Interagency Fire Center, which is called NIFC. We love our acronyms in the government. You're going to hear plenty tonight. And NIFC is located in Boise, Idaho. And this is a picture of the National Incident Coordinating Center in NIFC. There's also the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, NWCG, which is another organization that works under NIFC there in Boise, is their headquarters as well. And the interesting thing about NIFC and NWCG is all these different agencies that are involved. So this is from their headquarters building here. And this is the agencies that are predominantly involved. So you've got Department of the Interior, you've got Bureau of Land Management, you've got Department of Defense, you've got the U.S. Fire Administration, you've got Fish and Wildlife, you've got us in the Forest Service, you've got the National Association of State Foresters, NOAA, who does all of our weather stuff, and the National Park Service. So these folks all work together out of NIFC and NWCG to help coordinate wildland fire response. So I don't think I have to tell you how hard it is to get 9 different government agencies to agree on white versus black, let alone what a fire response should look like. But they do a pretty good job on the whole. Sometimes there's some arguments in the background about different minor points, but on the whole, they've come up with some good guidance and documentation and seem to run things pretty well for us. So this is the new version of the fire map. I pulled this one Monday. Yeah, I think this is Monday. I did put the website up there, but you can also just Google fire map, fire information. And the cool thing about the new system is you can hover, and this is just a photo, so I can't do it and demonstrate it here, but you can hover over any one of those sites. You can zone in on it, and when you click on it, it'll pull up and kind of tell you what's going on in that particular fire and what the size is. We talk about something called PL levels within the agency or within wildland fire. Whoop, let me go backwards. And so PL stands for preparedness level, and preparedness levels go from 1 to 5, 1 meaning nothing's burning and 5 meaning the world is on fire. It has been a couple years since we've spent any significant time in PL5, maybe a day or two, but not significant weeks on end. So it's been a couple years since there. We do tend to spend a couple weeks in PL4, typically later in the summer. And most of the time we're not. So we are currently at PL1, as it says right here in the sit rep. This was actually last Friday. We were at PL1, and I think I heard this morning we're still there. But it's just kind of cool to know the lingo. So what PL stands for and what that's based on is kind of how many assets are out there doing what they do. So one thing you have to know about wildland fire is that you've got to know your incident command system. That is just an absolute must. I'm not sure as far as with the students and the residents, what point in time in their lifetime they learn this. I know I learned it very early on in my career, especially when I was working with NDMS. It was required, but the classes are all online through FEMA. You just Google NIMS or Incident Command or ICS, and you can sign up to take some of those online classes for free. And at least the basic ones are are kind of key to understanding anything in the fire world, whether it's wildland or structure or any other kind of emergency response, disaster preparedness, etc. Good knowledge of ICS is important. It gives us this standardized approach to the incident management, and it's used across all levels of government. And the nice thing about ICS is it's scalable, so it works for a small incident as well as a big and complicated one. And it can even be used for things like planned events. So today I went on a hike that was a memorial hike for a fallen peace officer in the Forest Service. And when we got there, the person who had organized the hike had filled out a 208. So a 208 is an incident management form that deals with all hazards and safety for the event. But he had not filled out a 206, which is the medical plan. But anyway, just so you know, it can be used for planned events as well as unplanned events. It enables the coordinated response among all the different jurisdictions and agencies. It's a common language. Everybody knows how to play in the ICS world. Common processes for planning and resource management, and how you integrate outside resources. So if you've got a private fire engine and a county fire engine and a federal fire engine all showing up on scene, everybody knows what to do within the incident command system, and it works quite well. So ICS drives it all, and it's the only thing that even loosely ties together the large variety of the medical folks that are on the scene.
Fun fact there too is ICS actually grew out of wildland firefighting incident command frameworks developed in Southern California.
Yeah, I think the first time I took ICS would have been the 1990s. After I worked a plane crash, and we had all kinds of people, large plane crash, and we had all kinds of people show up, and they were like, yeah, you need to go to take ICS. And I was like, okay, cool. So it was fun. I was the only doctor in a class full of firefighters, but it was interesting. So having said that, what kind of medical assets do show up on a wildland fire? Well, you've got the fire line going forward type people. So if you've got a hot shot crew or a smoke jumper crew, or even a hand crew, these are the different kinds of crews that are out on the fire line fighting the fire. They may have some embedded medical assets like an EMT within their system. You have some medical assets that are based out of what we call a spike camp. So you'll have like a main incident command post, and then if it's a big fire, you'll have different spike camps closer to the fire line where people will spend the night before they go back out again. And so you'll typically have some medical assets sitting at the spike camp. We have all kinds of different rendezvous points that are mapped out, typically by the Med-El. We'll get to that, where we can station people. We have stationed assets like ambulances, and then here we go, more acronyms, REMS and RATs. And REMS is a rapid extrication module, and a RAT is a reach and treat module. And these are both types of teams that can get to an ill or injured person on a fire line relatively quickly. So they can get to the person relatively quickly, and if they're a REMS team, they come with some extrication equipment to help them get that person out quickly. A RATS team just does some treatment while they wait for someone else. So those are pretty cool. Sometimes those are UTV based, sometimes they're truck based, sometimes they're on foot. So different configurations of these rescue teams. So think of these as like a rescue team. We have air operations, right? All kinds of air operations. We can have some contracted medical helicopters, like a typical air ambulance. We might contract with one of those if it's a very large agency to sit at the helibase. We have what we call agency helicopters, although the Forest Service as an agency doesn't own any helicopters. We lease them all, but they're operated by our agency personnel. So we have a lot of agency helicopters that are out there in the field. And we'll talk a little bit, if we have time, we'll talk about short haul. I've got a little clip on that. They're mainly there for fire, but they can be configured to do medical. And then at the incident command post itself, we have other medical assets like the medical unit leader tent. So the medical unit leader is the person who's going to kind of regulate all these different people who show up. We have medical response trailers. Some of you may be familiar with those. These can be commercially operated, or they're operated by a local government, a county government, or even a university or school. They may have a medical trailer that they'll pull out on a scene to help give some care on the scene. Huge variety, everything from what I call the Taj Mahal fifth wheel trailer type medical setup. I swear to God, they could probably do an appendectomy, and others that'll just show up that's like a U-Haul with a box of Band-Aids in the back. It's kind of all over the map. And then, of course, we have all of our local medical facilities. Here on the East Coast, that's our benefit. We're never too far from good medical care. When we're out in the West or in Alaska, medical care can be a very long way away. So sometimes that's not our best option. So the medical unit leader, we call him the Med-L, is the one who coordinates all the incoming medical assets. And that's not a small task. So he's the person who will take, like, here's a private ambulance, let's say an AMR ambulance, and here's a county ambulance, and here's a CAL FIRE unit, and here's a Forest Service unit, and here's a Park Service unit, and here's a tribal unit. And they're all coming up and they have to figure out who needs to be where, station them where it makes the most sense, who needs a spike camp medical person that's got like antacids and such, and who doesn't need that. So the medical unit leader on the incident is at the command post in general and works hand in hand with either operations or logistics or sometimes safety, it depends on how it's structured, to set up all of the medical response for the wildland fire. So I tried to pull a couple maps to illustrate this, and you'll see in a minute, some of my favorite ones are ones I took myself, which include all the sticky notes and Post-its, because that's what this map ends up with by the end of the day. So this is a pretty big fire. This is the bedrock from last August. And you'll divide a fire up into divisions, and there'll be different lines of attack and where different people are sitting. And the incident command post, I think on this one, was sitting right here. Well, it's pretty obvious you can't have all of your medical assets sitting right there, right? All of these medical assets sitting where that orange square is aren't going to do the people all the way on the far side any good. So that's where the medical unit leader has their work cut out for them. You also have to figure out where are the roads and where are the access points. Where's a good landing zone? Where should we stage a helicopter? So here's another map. This was an air ops map. And again, this was I don't remember which one this was. Oh, this is Moose. Oh, good Lord. This was a big boy. So this was the Moose fire. And you can see they have divisions within the branches, multiple branches attacking this fire. And this fire, we did have, unfortunately, a total of 3 fatalities over the season of this fire. And this fire burned almost 16 weeks in Idaho. So these are not, that's the other piece you have to think of in wildland fire. It's a little bit different than a structure fire or any other emergency medical incident that's typically gone within maybe a day, maybe 2 days, depending on mop up. So we'll talk a little bit about the individual medical assets that are out there. So the fire line going forward, folks, like I said, some of them have the hotshot crews. They'll have an EMT with them. Smoke jumpers usually have at least one with them. And the care is going to be limited by what they carry on their person, unless they have a vehicle close by, like a Forest Service vehicle. So not a whole lot of advanced care, not a whole lot of equipment. So it's a little bit challenging for them. Their primary duty is to fight the fire. Medical duty as an EMT on the fire line is considered collateral duty. You are still there to fight the fire and dig the line. For those fire line going forward assets, they do need to be red carded. We'll talk about that. And they need to be arduous pack test or work capacity tested. So what does that mean? Well, a red card is a piece of paper that lists on it that you have been trained or taken courses that enables you to be on a fire. So that includes some basic wildland fire classes, some good wildland fire safety things. You have to be trained and test in your fire shelter, be able to deploy your fire shelter within a certain amount of time and be safe in that. So that's required to be anywhere near the fire line. To be out on the line going forward, you also have to have what's called an arduous level work capacity test, which is 3 miles, 45 minutes, 45 pounds. That has to be done annually. So that's for those fire line forward folks. They're fairly fit folks.
And just to add a little bit of context, because I was a Forest Service firefighter out west, most crews have at minimum 1 EMT, and many have multiple because you can't work like 7 days of the week when you're just on forest. But that's essentially like a grassroots effort. That's not due to any requirement to have that.
That's right. And that's a very good point that Kyle makes that I always like to emphasize is these guys are all what we call collateral duty. We're working hard to change that. Because it's not in their job descriptions and it's not we don't hire EMTs in the Forest Service. I always say we have 1,500 of them, but we don't hire EMTs. We hire firefighters or trail crew or dozer operators who happen to be EMTs. And that's where it gets a little bit challenging sometimes for us as an agency. So this is actually a BLM crew. Sorry, don't want to misclassify these folks as Forest Service, but of course they're out there too. They're carrying I think that's a TRS. Can't tell by the pack, but I think that's a TRS. And then this is a shot I took of a smoke jumper aircraft where the jumpers would sit. And this little cardboard box up here towards the front, it says right on there, trauma box. So they'll shove all this out of the airplane onto the fire scene, the people and the supplies. So then we have somebody who's not quite so far forward. Maybe they're based out of their truck or their vehicle. And this is a typical Wildland fire truck. It's got some hose, it's got some stuff, it's got lots of chainsaws and things like that, because that's what's really the most helpful out there. And it has a medical kit, and maybe it has an EMT. And it's, again, as you can see, pretty limited supplies, not a whole lot of advanced stuff here. We're not doing a whole lot of ALS care here. And yeah, you're out there on the line out. I went out on this prescribed burn, so please give me no credit for being on the actual fire. It was a prescribed burn. It was perfectly safe. Then we have this medical care based at these spike camps we talked about. So at the spike camps, you might get something called the 100-person kit. So there's a spike camp. And in one of the tents, it looks like a yurt, basically. Looks like a Western shelter. You'll get a 100-person kit, which is a big box that's basically, I call it a CVS in a box. It's got some ibuprofen and Tylenol. It's got some boo-boo Band-Aids and tape, some anti-itch stuff, some cord aids, some eye wash, because of course you're getting all kinds of grit in your eyes, and some pretty basic supplies. Not even really typically what we would call EMS supplies. When we talk about EMS, these are just general medical supplies. Then usually the medical unit leader will sit at the incident command post area, and that can be almost anywhere. This particular one was actually the Moose Fire, which was inside what used to be a former department store that had been closed for business, out of business. So they took it over as the ICP, and the medical tent. The medical section was sectioned off in the back, and the levels of care in these will vary widely, but this is also set up almost like a CVS minute clinic. So there's some stuff there you can help yourself to. Typically with the Med-El, there's at least one EMT or someone else who can help guide you to the right stuff, but they're letting you kind of take care of yourself. This is another medical unit leader setup. So this one's more in the field. This was at a secondary command post. And again, you can see there, they've got, just some boxes of generic supplies. They've got cough drops sitting there and tissues and some sting relief pads and probably cord aid and cortisone. One of the more popular things in a medical unit leader tent is generally the foot care station. At the end of a long day, a lot of the Wildland fire folks will come in and have some pretty nasty foot issues, whether it's blisters or even trench foot from having sweated too much. We had an outbreak of that last year. And then we've got the local support. So we've got local hospitals, but in a lot of the Wildland fire environment, these are rural and critical access, so they're easily overrun with numbers of patients. And these rural hospitals may have very limited pharmacy supply and resupply. And in addition to that, the local EMS assets and hospitals are generally already pretty busy managing their home 911 territory in the setting of a wildland fire. So I know last summer we had a big fire in southwestern Oregon, which burns every year. And we had quite a bit of poison oak there. And our wildland firefighters were going into the local ER to get steroids, basically for severe contact dermatitis. And we were sending maybe 10 or 12 a day, which, you know, we probably don't think is that much, but this was a critical access hospital. They had one doc who staffs at 24-hour shifts. They had one pharmacy in town that was closed, you know, after 5 and on weekends. And the doc from the hospital called me and said, you guys are sending, you know, 10, 12 of your firefighters in to get steroid shots or steroid prescriptions. And, you know, we normally only see 25 patients a day, and we're already seeing 30 because of the smoke and everything else going on in our neighborhood. Now you've put 10 or 12 on top of that. Now that little system is overrun. And on top of that, he called me again a couple days later and said, we're completely out. We don't have any more dexamethasone, methylprednisolone, prednisone. Our pharmacy in town doesn't have any more, and we're not getting resupplied for 3 days. So in the right setting, it doesn't take much to overwhelm the local medical assets, which is why we try to pretty heavily support our own in the wildland fire environment. So there's always much more medical support than one would think is necessary, but this is exactly why. So in addition to the local folks, and we've talked about the fire line going, and we've talked about some of the truck-based and the tent-based and the command-based, there's a group of individuals that we could not do the job without that show up from other agencies. We call these people cooperators. Cooperators are fireline crews that are government entities. In other words, they're taxpayer paid. They're not commercial, but they show up and work with us on federal response. So CAL FIRE is probably the one everybody's the most familiar with, especially now since they have their own TV show, which is, you know, kind of corny, but whatever, it's still cool. Sedona Fire out of Arizona, Aurora, Colorado. I mean, there's 1,000,001 cooperators. These are just a few I've pulled that will travel to a fire anywhere in the country. I know we had Aurora Fire was actually in the Roanoke area at one point, helping respond to some of the fires in Shenandoah this winter. So just so you know, there were cooperators out there from all across the country. So they will help us out in a variety of ways, and they bring their medical help when we ask them to. And then we have contracted medical support. So this is under what's called the VIPER agreement, which is the virtual incident procurement system. It's called VIPER because they didn't want it to be called VIP, but that's what it stands for, is virtual incident procurement. And the contract underwent a revision about 1.5 years ago. So last year was the first year with new contract. There was a little bit of wailing and gnashing of teeth, but it was absolutely necessary because before that there was no standard. And sometimes you got a basic ambulance with no equipment and no people. And sometimes you got a fully equipped ALS ambulance with tons of people. And we just had to set a standard because you never knew what you were going to get. So we now have standards for BLS units, ALS units, and the people that come with them and what should show up on the scene. So this is just a picture of one of the contracted ambulances that I took out in the field. So the requirements were all updated in 2023. Unfortunately, and I was just on a call on the National Logistics call earlier today when the contracted people were talking about it, and even they admit they made a mistake. The entire VIPER contract is written and it refers to everything as EMR. And for those of us in the EMS world, we know that EMR is a level of certification, right? Emergency medical responder is an EMR. Then we have an EMT, then we have AEMTs, and we have paramedics. When the government wrote the contract, they didn't have any medical subject matter experts in there. So everything became EMR, which stands for Emergency Medical Responder. And by that, they meant everything, including the ambulance, to the people of any and all skill levels. So it's a little bit of an unfortunate acronym they put into that contract. We talked a little bit about trailers already. So here's a picture of a trailer. I think this one was on the Moose Fire. This was quite the setup. This was a huge trailer, a huge fifth wheel. You could just see, here they are just opening one of their many drawers that they had, drawers and drawers of equipment and supplies and medications. They had 2 or 3 places to lay people down in. They had full ALS capabilities. It was pretty impressive. I was very jealous. I would love to work out of something like this. It was the Taj Mahal. So now that I've kind of given you the background, this is what it all looks like. The operational incident, which is the wildland fires there in the orange. And all these different medical people show up. So the people in the light blue are generally all your local or in-state assets that are familiar with the area and already part of the 911 system and are there to kind of help you out. Maybe they're under memorandums of agreement or mutual aid agreements or other things that they're going to come into that. So they generally will come in pretty much ready to go. You have the people in the green, which is the feds. You have us in the Forest Service, and you have some of the other land management agencies such as the BLM and NPS and Fish and Wildlife. And if they are participating in a federally credentialed EMS system, then they also arrive ready to go. So Forest Service, we credential our EMTs, and if they are credentialed with us, they arrive ready to go. BLM has a program called OMSP, which stands for Operational Medical Support Program. And it's a little bit of a hybrid. It's a cool program run by my friend, Dr. Southard, Drew Southard, who runs the BLM program. So those folks arrive kind of nationally credentialed and ready to go with their own unique set of protocols designed for the wildland. NPS also has some nationally credentialed level folks that'll show up ready to go. Their system is undergoing some changes, so it's not quite as robust as it used to be, but it will be again. And so those folks, if they're credentialed within the federal agency, can show up on an incident pretty much ready to go. Where we run into issues is with the contractors up in the orange. So a lot of these contracted companies will come in from out of state. So now you've got potentially an ambulance or a medical trailer, a bunch of EMTs, maybe a nurse, maybe a doc, all showing up from a different state. So now you've got state licensing requirements to meet for the people, also maybe for the ambulance, and it gets a little bit tricky. So a lot of these companies that do wildland fire support, medical support, typically will pick maybe 10 states they want to be operating out of for the summer because we don't know where the fires are going to be. So a lot of the bigger companies will obtain licenses and obtain medical directions in a handful of states, and then they will put themselves available in the system to go out to those states where they are ready to go. Sometimes they'll show up and they're not ready to go, and we try to get some, they're supposed to get like I think it's 48 hours to try and get everything lined up, but it's hard. It's hard if they're not showing up ready to go. The purple folks is those cooperators we talked about. They're the ones I feel kind of bad for because they don't have that ability to contract with a local medical control or anybody in the area where they're going to ahead of time because they're taxpayer funded public agencies. So when they show up, they have to jump through whatever local state hoops are. So if CAL FIRE shows up in Utah to fight a fire, or Colorado or Idaho, they have to go through those states' EMS credentialing processes and make sure that they're ready to go before they can go out on the line. And that's a pain. So we're working on that. And then there's the individuals who come out of the on an individual resource order who might just make themselves available. And again, depending on what their background is, they also have to jump through the hoops. So the bottom line is that every category has its own method, and they all have to adhere to either state or federal guidelines and regulations. And it's a mess. It's a real mess. So one of the big things that happened last year was the the National Commission on Wildland Fire gave a report out. We were congressionally delegated, and the report out to Congress happened in September, and there were 136 recommendations, final recommendations out of the 2 years of work of the commission. Recommendation number 94, centered on EMS, very happy about that, and basically said, hey, we've got to fix this. If there's a wildland fire and a bunch of medical support is showing up to support the fire, we need to make it easier for everybody to just be able to go out there and get the job done. These people are not coming in to participate in a local 911 system. They're not coming in to steal patients, away from a paying ambulance company. They're just coming in to treat the medical illnesses and injuries on the fire. We're there to treat our own. So the message got through to Congress. I was contacted by some legislators about 5 or 6 weeks ago, and they are drafting some legislation which we hope will fix this in the future, but I don't think I need to tell you that the pace of legislation is not the pace of emergency medicine. How's that? That's probably as politically correctly as I can put it. All right, so now you're out there. You've got all your assets out there and something crappy happens. What do you do? So we have a system, what's called an incident within an incident, or an IWI. So if somebody goes down, there's a whole process that happens, and every single person from your basic first year wildland firefighter all the way up to the chiefs knows this process cold. They know exactly what to do. They're trained on it. It's in their handbooks. It's in their pocket guides. And it's how we manage all incidents. So they basically do a medical incident report, and it's not the most beautiful thing for medical care. It doesn't really talk a lot about the actual problem. It actually talks more about where are we and what do we need to get this person out of here and how quick should it happen. And that's basically what this is. It's not to be confused with a patient care report. There is some clinical information included. Obviously, we need to know if it's a head injury versus a femur fracture versus an MI. But the predominant purpose of the MIR is to get people the heck out and to medical care.
For those familiar with like TCCC or military medicine,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
a 9-line, and
It
that's
is.
what firefighters
Yeah.
call it too.
Yep. They call it the 8-line or the 9-line. And they have for decades, but we have been under strict guidance from on high to stop calling it that. So I try very hard to say MIR every time.
Fair enough.
But yes, it was originally born out of the military, actually, Vietnam era, used for dust off helicopter evacuations of wounded soldiers. All right. How am I doing time-wise? You guys tell me. Am I doing all right? I guess.
Yeah, you're doing great.
Okay, so there's a lot of other cool toys and tricks out there on the scene. We talked a little bit about REMS and rats. So that lower photo is me and my office companion there, Bob. And that's a rat team right there that we met up with. So they are stationed way far forward in this unit that's got a bunch of ALS equipment on the back. And it's got a full ALS kit. It's got 2 paramedics, and it can get to a patient quickly, but you can tell by looking at it that it can't take the patient out. It can just get care to them as they wait for someone to get them out. We've got a short haul there. I think that was an NPS. Yeah, that's National Park Service photo off of Mount Whitney. And then our friends at the BLM, they're doing another training using some helicopter assets. So really cool things out there. Short haul is a pretty cool program. It's been life-saving already for us as an agency. So this is a neat website that you can type into if you're on an incident, and it will tell you where are the ships that are located that are capable of short haul. And when you're on the live version and you click on one of these little helicopters, a little window will pop up and tell you where are they assigned, who's on it, who's their main person, what's the phone number, what are they available for. And it's the only thing I have to emphasize with these short haul ships is that they are fire assets. These are basically there for helitack fire response. So they're not just sitting there waiting for a medical call. They're doing other things. So if there is a medical call for short haul, they have to have to be able to stop what they're doing and reconfigure to get a patient. Let's see. Yep, this was on the Pinnacle. There was a patient who had fallen down here. It was a firefighter, had fallen down a very, very steep ravine. This photo does it little justice, but this is a river at the bottom. And that was kind of the little ledge he landed on. And here's kind of an overhead view again. Here's the river. This is where the patient was. So the helicopter flew over, saw the patient, comes over here, lands, and reconfigures for a short haul. And this is kind of the time frame. So they will, if you've got a good crew with the patient, they start the packaging already, you can put a patient into a Bauman bag pretty easily, and then you get them rigged up And away they go. I make it sound so easy. It's not. Let's see if I can get this to play. Okay. So you'll see that the patient is in the Bauman bag, and that's the EMT on the short haul ship. And the patient goes up and the EMT rides along with them underneath the helicopter. This one was really well done. They were only on scene 17 minutes to get this guy packaged, which is pretty daggone amazing considering where they were. And then the short haul ship takes them away someplace. So that's for us in Wildland Fire. I mean, for people in the commercial EMS world, if I told you from the time you called for help until the person got to an air ambulance was an hour and 48 minutes, we'd all be horrified. But in the Wildland Fire, this is amazingly fast. This is amazingly fast that they got this guy out. But you can see that short haul is basically the medic and the patient stay underneath the helicopter. And they're basically taken a very short distance while suspended underneath the helicopter to an area where an air ambulance could land, because this is not an air ambulance, it's a helicopter. And this is the patient. Femur injury, typical wildland firefighter, all happy with his helicopter ride. And so the bottom line for us and the agencies, we got to train for it all and all the conditions. And that's just sort of an overview of what medical care in a wildland fire environment looks like. And I am sure the other folks in the room have way more to say about it than I do. So I will, there we go. I will be quiet.
Any questions for Dr. Curry? Or Kyle and Jameson, anything you want to add right now before you take over? Or Janelle?
Just, I guess, you guys probably didn't notice like a lot of tourniquets or gauze or any like kind of the basic EMS things. And yeah, as it stands right now, it's a national problem. It's not like a Forest Service problem. Like those things aren't supplied like through the fire supply. So crews just have to get those on their own. So that's kind of one of the big things that I think is hopefully changing in the future.
Yeah, so we did just update the individual first aid kits at NWCG. We did it this winter. The little white plastic box that hasn't been updated for 25 years. If you have one, hang on to it. It's now an antique. People never, it was a little white plastic box. I have a photo on a different slide deck, and in it was like a couple of Band-Aids and some moleskin. It was really quite the joke. There was nothing that was going to save anybody in that box, and most folks took everything out of that box and used it for something else. It was a handy box, but we did update it, and the new individual first aid kit does come with a tourniquet, rolls of gauze, and other things. It got all the way through the EMC. It got through the exec board. It's in the hands of the cash managers, so I'm not sure when it's going to actually be stocked. We were hoping for this year because we hurried up and did it in December, but I don't know. But yeah, you're right. That other one was just crazy.
Saw a couple of questions in the comments. Kyle and I'll wait and let you talk through some of those if you want to.
Now that I got my screen back up, let's see if I can read them. Okay, how can physicians get involved? And then related to that, how did I get my job? How can physicians get involved? Well, right now, you can get involved in a variety of different ways, but the easiest way to get involved is through a role called LEMA, Local Emergency Medical Advisor. I'd be dead without them. I have 84 of them right now. So we try to assign a local emergency medical advisor to every forest and or every unit. So we have law enforcement units as well as avalanche centers and research units that might have EMTs. And I count on those local emergency medical docs to work with those crews. So for instance, if you're on the GW Jefferson National Forest, it's important to work with the local doc there because that local doc is going to know what those EMS providers on that forest need. And it's going to be different than what they need on the Chugach up in Alaska, on the Stanislaus in Southern California, on the Osceola down in Florida. So these local docs work with that. So an easy way to get involved is to become a Lehman. You can shoot me an email and I'll keep you in my list and also let you know if there's a forest that's in need. I don't have terribly many in need right now, but people come and go all the time. I'm working on that, a couple forests right now. So that's an easy way. And how did I get my job? Dumb luck and stupidity. Honestly, I had spent 30 years in the ER. I worked a year in New Zealand, and when I came back, I didn't want to go back to full-time directing of my ER and all that other stuff I was doing. So as I was working my night shifts, I just kind of kept trolling the USA Jobs site. And one night it popped in and I noticed that it closed that day. So I started working on it at 4 a.m. and I stayed over my night shift and filled out the application. I think I finished at 9 because of course it's a government application. So it's not an easy thing. And then I was lucky enough to make it to the interview process and eventually get hired. But I will tell you, as I am doing this job at the right time for me in my life, and I love what I'm doing, and I feel like I'm in a position where I can share my expertise and knowledge with an agency that's ready to hear it and maybe make some changes that have been long overdue. But it is not a career you will make any money at. Like anything EMS and like anything wilderness medicine, at this, like I said, I'm lucky to be far enough in my career. I don't have big debts or anything like that, that I can afford to do what I like because it sure doesn't pay well.
I think what we can do is get back to like search and rescue and EMS and National Park, National Forest medical direction afterwards, because I have questions myself. But this is to somewhat preface it. I've been talking with basically guests who have this journal club series that have joined over the past couple of years, but I texted my group and basically we're going to have a session all about wildland and federal land EMS, also covering the newest hot off the press WMS search and rescue medical director CPG, and that's going to be in January. So there will definitely be a follow-up on this that I'm excited about. But let's get back to wildland fire. So Jameson and Kyle, can you take it away with the 2 articles for the session? And then I would love to chat about all this again after, but let's get back because I'm sure these students have some studying to do too.
Yeah, sure. And as a quick aside to everyone on here, if you decide to take a position as a Lima, I implore you, if not beg you, to actually figure out what your wildland firefighters are doing there, or your national park people or whatever, and be super involved and take care of them.
Hopefully everyone's seeing the PowerPoint now.
Yep, we see it. I hear you too.
All right, awesome. So yeah, we'll be talking through a couple articles here about basically epidemiology of wildland firefighting. Kind of more focused on the federal wildland firefighting, but covering everything. Yeah, so I'm Kyle Carr. I'm currently an officer in the Air Force. I realized I don't have a disclaimer in here saying that none of these opinions are those of the government or the Air Force or the Department of Defense. They're all my own. So that's out there now. But yeah, I'm currently in medical school at Uniformed Services University. and I was a GS4 forestry technician, which is the old name for firefighter. Now they're actually called firefighters finally. So things have come a long way, and not too long. But I fought fires on I fought on an engine on the Tahoe National Forest in the 2019 season, and then on a Helitech crew. Got my crew shirt on now, on the Shasta Trinity National Forest, helicopter 506. So that was my experience. That was in 2020, which is, as Dr. Curry said, kind of the last time we were in PL5, PL4 a lot. So it was busy. And I was kind of the go-to medic on the crews, but there's no like designated crew medic. Anyone who is an EMT, and there was usually kind of every fourth or fifth crew member in California anyway was an EMT. So yeah. Jameson.
I'm Jameson Gerasi. I was an infantry captain in the Army. I have a lot more experience with like some of the military pre-hospital stuff. I was a hotshot for a week, and I got rhabdo a couple summers ago, and I worked as a wildland fire medic since then during the summers. And yeah, that's about it.
All right. So first off, this is kind of an overview we did. We kind of wrote a paper that's not yet published on kind of the EMS in the federal firefighting system. Dr. Curry's Forest Service and where I worked is all under the USDA, and kind of everything else is under the Department of Interior. When I was there, the Forest Service definitely claimed it was the largest firefighting agency in the world, with over 10,000 firefighters like each season. Wouldn't be surprised if that is the same today. There's about 18,000 federal firefighters out there a year, and yeah, it's kind of not well known how many of those are EMS qualified. So here is the paper that Dr. Gardner put out there for y'all. So they kind of looked at the US DOI injuries that were reported. I think that's kind of important to note in this kind of wildland firefighter culture. Speaking from personal experience, I had the only thing I remember ever being reported was one of those poison oak injuries that one of my crewmates had. Unfortunately, he was quite sensitive. He went because he had anaphylaxis twice in like a couple weeks just from poison oak burning. But yeah, he got a lot of steroids that season. But I had crewmates who had literally broken arms that were still at work, because a lot of the culture then, and I think still now, is that overtime is the main driver of working in wildland fire. If you're not getting overtime, even if you're on workers' comp getting your base pay, you might not be really making any money. I had crewmates out there, and I think pay has raised about 50% since the Tim Hart Act was passed by Congress a couple years ago. So that's awesome for the community. But yeah, I had crewmates making like $200 to $300 a paycheck, kind of take home pay.
Yeah, if you
Sorry.
where'd you go? Yeah, if you go to the next slide with the results on it, it's kind of to his point with that, where you see the total of 1,301 non-fatal injuries in a 5-year period. That's non-fatal injuries that like required firefighters to leave the line. That's non-fatal injuries to most frequently firefighters that were not directly firefighting. You're gonna see like a significantly reduced number of injuries in your hot shots and your helitack guys, because things to consider is they don't want to come off the line. There's, as we talked about with the Limas, not necessarily at the fault of the Limas or anyone else, there's not necessarily a huge trust in the medical direction, as there are in a lot of organizations, because there's a gap between the people working and the people working to help them. And another consideration is the demographic that your firefighters are coming out of. You have a lot of people that are college students, or people that grew up without insurance, or kind of a general distrust of the U.S. healthcare system. So, if they have something that they think is going to be more expensive financially than to like live with, you're not going to necessarily see it. Like as Dr. Curry said, they had an insane number of people show up with trench foot over the last couple of years. Sure, especially with the Alaska situation, and those are just guys that were like, you know, screw it, I'll tie my boots a lot tighter and just walk through it for the next 20 days. And
Yeah, it's also
you know,
very rural. That's where wildland fires happen, obviously, out in the woods. So you're gonna have a lot, kind of everything you'd see in rural healthcare, potentially to a slightly stronger extreme because of all of the environmental factors and exposures you have on the line. And then, like I said, this is 1,300 non-fatal injuries reported over 5 years from a roughly like 6,000 person yearly firefighting cohort in the DOI. So do with that what you will. I guess 1 in 5 of those roughly had some kind of reportable injury. Not that those were the same people season after season, because there's so many temp and seasonal jobs.
and
Going
then
on.
sorry, go ahead.
Do you have anything on this slide?
I was gonna say it notes the mechanism of injury as slips, trips, and falls as the most common, which is not necessarily untrue, but again, when you separate the demographic of like the ultra fit firefighters are the ones that are 20 miles forward, not really coming back to base, and some of the people that are maybe your like your more experienced veteran government employees or people working on dozers are a bit different demographic. So you're gonna see, you know, like there were however many deaths from cardiac arrests last year, and not many of those are coming from the guys that are running 30 miles on their weekend off.
Yeah, and we'll discuss the actual fatalities a little bit later too. So yeah, as you see here, severe injuries, mostly slips, trips, and falls, equipment, tools, machinery. Speaking from experience, most of that machinery is probably chainsaws. Lots of you'll see a lot of cuts on boots from close encounters with chainsaws. They're scary, and that's the day-to-day of most of these federal firefighters. A lot of state firefighters, they use a lot more engine crews and hose and water. Federal is like the bread and butter is kind of just going out and cutting line. So you're cutting down trees, doing basically really bad landscaping, kind of gutting rid of everything you can to stop the fire. So yeah, a lot of chainsaws, bites and stings. I kind of, yeah, I mean, we do a lot of good screening now of firefighters with the arduous pack test is pretty good for the feds. There's nothing like saying that you can't be out there and have a bee allergy, but that probably does screen itself out over time. Same with poison oak. Like I said, lots of people get poison oak, and yeah. But we'll see. I have kind of some pie charts of actual fatalities on fires, and you'll see how motor vehicles account for a lot more of those than these non-severe or severe injuries or non-fatal. Anything else, Jameson?
No, and it, kind of as we were talking about before, I think your 17 to 24-year-old age group is like massively underrepresented in this, even though they're like the vast majority. I mean, I think on a hand crew or a hotshot crew, you'd be shocked to see more than one person over 33.
Yeah, over time, it wears on the body. So these are kind of incidents and injuries, but in terms of the chronic MSK issues, you'll see whether you're a Lima or you're the ER doc taking care of these guys just because they happen to be around. Those are the most common, like just aches and pains, classic low back pain, all that. And certainly like those can become workers' comp issues, but they're not well represented here.
Yeah, and something that I think Kyle and I will continue to hammer because it's a big passion project of ours is the amount of and Dr. Curry talked about it with trying to increase the supplies and capabilities. So many injuries that are not appearing on here are treated you know, 1 mile, 10 miles, 20 miles forward of anyone that's ever going to write that down or chart it.
Yeah,
So
having been
you're,
like a 2-year, 2-season EMT, I never documented a single injury of any of my crew members. Even you know, when it becomes another crew, you know, yeah, you're gonna want to like talk to someone about that, but whether or not your boss actually makes you document it or documents it, that's not gonna be necessarily there. And also another big thing with the Tim Hart Act, which I know we talked a little bit about and didn't give a lot of background on, that was passed by Congress to kind of just support wildland firefighters in all ways, including pay, but also including health benefits and insurance. So they started like a cancer registry for wildland firefighters. That's been around for structure firefighters for a long time. So the smoke inhalation and everything. And wildland firefighters, well, it sounds like wildland. Like, I mean, I was on an engine, like I said, for a season. I still fought structure fires directly, like with SCBAs. I also fought vehicle fires, one of which, maybe this is illuminating for the culture, like our boss didn't let us put on our SCBAs because he didn't want to do the paperwork for it, for like the exposure report afterward. So as a Lima, you know, that's something you want to be aware of and kind of counseling against, hopefully, to look out for your people. But yeah.
yeah. And one other consideration from the Lima angle, because I know most everyone here is going to be probably looking at it from that, is like the forest that I was in up in Pocatello, our the Lima or whichever medical director we were working with up there was like incredibly passionate about trying to get crews with certified EMTs, because if you're a red card firefighter but you don't have your like EMT F certs and a bunch of other certs, if you're not keeping up with your national certs, then you know there's obviously some gray areas with actually treating people or documenting it or taking them to hospitals or flying with them or whatever. So if you do work on a forest, like, yes, your crew might have 5 EMTs on it, like mine did, but if only one of those EMTs is like certified or licensed or is recognized by the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service as an EMT, and then they break their arm on the first day, then you're going to spend the first half of the season relying on a random Canadian guy like our crew did to take care of all your people or to document your injuries.
Yeah.
So the people are willing to help, and if you're at working as a Lima and you're willing, then I think you can set your people up for an enormous amount of success.
And I think
Absolutely.
it's important to note that Kyle and Jameson here are talking about the history of where we were and why it was so bad, and why the Forest Service decided to establish a more formal EMS program, which is how and why I got a job. I'm the first ever medical director for the Forest Service. They never had one before. We never had a formal process for any of this, and they're giving really great examples as to why we needed it. So now, to be an EMT in the Forest Service out there treating patients, you do have to be credentialed by the agency. You can't just have an EMT cert. You've got to be credentialed by the agency that has your back. You've got to fall under medical direction. And you've got to have the ability to capture patient care interactions in a patient care report, which is different than an e-safety report, which is where a lot, unfortunately, historically, where a lot of our data has come from is safety and OSHA reporting requirements, which is completely different than medical reports. Anyway, I digress.
No,
Yeah,
thank you for
no,
highlighting that.
absolutely. And I mean, I took on plenty of personal kind of liability at the time as well in like 2020, because like she said, I didn't have like a Forest Service level way to register. There was no NREMT affiliation available for me. I was licensed in Colorado, working in California, and nationally registered, but and that was fine with my bosses, right? So like those are the big things that the Forest Service is changing now, which is awesome. Um, I was actually teaching medical stuff to people in my crew, like, and because I just had the most experience with it, but that didn't mean I was legally the best person to be doing it. So yeah, it's awesome now that Dr. Curry's there, because there wasn't a doctor I could call in the Forest Service when I worked there. So big gains lately. Um, and then takeaways from this first paper. So late season injuries accounted for basically like 2/3 of injuries compared to the early season. So having been out there, this is probably due to a lot of that fatigue. That after working multiple 14-day rolls, like it just adds up. You're away from family, you're tired, you're not necessarily like paying attention to what's right in front of you. As well as certainly in California, I can't speak for every region, but fire behavior is worse in the late season, just is. And that's how it is in most places. It just gets drier and drier until the first rains come. And then the decreasing vigilance kind of along with that fatigue, but also just getting too comfortable with the fires. And like we said, understanding that kind of culture and socioeconomics of wildland firefighting and the firefighters is probably key to functioning as a LEMA. So moving on to our second paper, which was
Before you move on,
Mhm.
I mean, I was gonna let you guys talk
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
like what's the role, and I specifically left all that out so they know what about these culture socioeconomics. It's pretty horrendous, I think.
Of the fire, yeah.
Yeah, I
So
mean, 14 days,
mhm.
16 hours a day,
Yeah, yeah. So
sleeping in the dirt and the smoke.
what it looks
Yeah.
like is our region 5 is California, so I can speak to that. The fire season, if you're a temp, you're on a 1039 contract, so 1,039 hours, which is about 6 months of work. But that can be extended up to 7 months or so if it's busy. Not like you're not required to do it. You can keep working. You're not, not under like a hard contract for it. But what it looks like is usually just 40-hour weeks because they, agencies don't want to pay overtime if there's no fires. Which is different from structure firefighting, certainly. There's not like 24/7 coverage, but you are expected to come in after work if you're not you're fully expected to kind of be on call if there's fires after work. Um, not to say you can't like have a beer, but that you're not coming in for that fire if you have beer, hopefully. And then a role when you go out on a fire, usually it's kind of you get called out and you're out for up to 14 days and you're working usually 16 hours a day, hopefully. That's what gets you the most overtime. And obviously you're away from home that whole time regardless. So they can put you on like 10 hours, but that's the worst. You want to be on the 16-hour to get the overtime. And then yeah, if you're like really on a big fire or you're on a spike camp, like Dr. Curry was talking about, then usually you get up at usually about 6 a.m., go over to breakfast, grab breakfast. There's a big fire meeting. This is assuming you're on day shift. And then you're kind of rolling out to the fire by about 7 a.m. a lot of the time, depending on what the camp looks like. And you're working till 7 8 p.m. basically until the sun goes down, or really until you're relieved by night shift. um and yeah, what that looks like is working with the chainsaws. You're required to show a lunch for 30 minutes. Like that's just a funny thing. It's like, yeah, no, you're not taking a lunch break really when you're on a big fire. Like there's work to do, and yeah, you might take a couple breaks sitting down, but it's not common if the fire is really going. And you'll have like a sack lunch given to you each day. A lot of the kind of bigger epidemiological things with like people get dyslipidemia and hypertension throughout the season. A lot of that I think has been attributed in the past. The Forest Service has done a really good job of studying that, but chronic fatigue and just poor diet kind of plays into it. Bad sleep, smoke exposure.
There's actually a really, I think it's the Anchor Point podcast. He did an episode with a nutritionist that works with either the Forest Service or the BLM, and they did like a pretty cool little like 2-hour conversation about some of her research on the effects of the season-long horrible diet on wildland firefighters, and they compare it to like the military and other first responders.
So yeah, whatever your job is that day, you're getting back to camp usually 7:30, 8 p.m. ish, depending on whether there's sunlight out. You're going to the dinner trailer, which people joke, but it was serious during COVID. Like, never touch the handrail, because the handrail on the dinner trailer will give you some sort of camp crud, some kind of unknown URI. So there are some other problems there. Food's usually okay, and like dinner should be the best meal of the day usually. If you're on a state fire in California, like the inmates make all the food, and it's really good because they also eat it, unlike some of the contractors on the federal side, I think. And then maybe you have time. There's a debrief usually within the crew and like a bigger fire level, and then hopefully you hit the sack by 10:30. Give you 7.5 hours of sleep, hopefully. Usually crews are pretty strict on like you can't wake up more than 15 minutes before like proper wake up time and like roll time, because nobody wants to be waken up by like the guy who's up an hour before, rattling around. So that's a kind of funny little culture thing too. Like, if you're ever out on a roll as a Lima, don't wake up more than 10 minutes before you gotta go. That's just, it's unwritten, but it will be spoken about. So that's what a roll kind of looks like, and you can do consecutive rolls, essentially. So sometimes it can be extended up to 21 days. Sometimes you'll be told to rest in place. So you'll do 14 days, do 2 days kind of in the local area, maybe hopefully like, an hour away from the fire or something, but maybe just like in the town that the fire camp is in, and then do another 14 days on that fire. You can be switched between fires in that 14 days, because kind of once you're on a roll, like you're an asset owned by that geographic area and they want to use you. So they'll keep using you if they can. And then, yeah, usually the 2 days that you're off, because it's a guaranteed 2 days off at the end of the 14-day roll, you can't be called in. It's like proper. You can be at home and do your laundry, get your bag set up to go again, all that kind of stuff. Most people don't shower, certainly not daily. Most people shower like once a week when they're on fires, maybe twice a week. I showered a lot, and I showered 3 times a week usually. So inmates actually have a required 48-hour shower at like the state level. So that's kind of funny. Federal, I say that because federal firefighters and inmate firefighters at the state level usually do about the same job. All of the state, city firefighters that are on a big wildland fire are usually doing like engine work, versus federal and inmate firefighters are doing hand crew work or helitack or kind of smaller, farther out work. So yeah, there was always like, you look over and you're like, man, like if I was an inmate, I'd get better food and a shower. Like that's kind of weird. So there's a lot of that at play with kind of the culture involved, but also people take pride in being dirty as firefighters. So don't get me wrong, it's not all bad. Like I had long hair and a beard when I was on the helitack crew, and it was always mangy, and that was totally acceptable and fine. So yeah.
What I think like a general like cultural view, if you
Mhm.
read the news, is that inmates who have been trained in and function at these wildland fire responses,
Mhm.
the national view is that they're quote unquote being taken advantage of, and that after their sentence is served, there's this perception that they have difficulty finding a career as a firefighter, whether at the wildland or the local EMS level. So
Yeah.
what are the views as far as like what you've seen in practice and what you've heard from those who have finished their sentences?
Yeah, so in practice, obviously like you're somewhat limited in what you can like interact with them, because they are, still incarcerated. But I know with the California program, and correct me anyone if you know more, is basically every day that you're on a fire, you get a day off your sentence. So if you can cut your sentence in half with that, I think that's pretty good. You also like talking to inmates a bit, like they want to be out there. It is better than being in prison. Like you're out in the woods, and most days aren't that like crazy hard. And so I think, like, personally, again, I think as a program, it's not bad. Not to say there aren't problems with the criminal justice system in America. I don't think anyone's going to say that it's perfect. But in terms of the opportunities afterwards, I think the biggest problem there is that Cal Fire in California is who runs the program. They will not hire inmates because they have so many applicants to work at Cal Fire. It's like a really pretty decent job for the level of education and training needed. Whereas federal agencies actually will hire inmates. So there is that weird former inmates, sorry, who have the experience from firefighting. They have all that practical job experience. Like they have a lot, they know what they're doing just as well as pretty much anyone. Yeah, like they're really good at what they do. I do want to say that. Like they're not quite a hotshot crew, but they function really close to the level of a hotshot crew. So having them next to you on the fire is like comforting.
Yeah, and there's
So,
there's
yeah.
obviously like a hiring factor as to like what they were detained for.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, to be an inmate firefighter, like it has to be like a non-violent crime, I believe. So
that's my
yeah, I
understanding.
think the hiring, yeah, that is a shame that they don't get hired more, especially by the agencies that are like training them. But I did actually like meet a couple former inmates who were like engine captains in the Forest Service. So
Yeah.
it's not entirely impossible.
They do notoriously have a hard time getting hired on structure departments afterwards, but that's
Mhm.
like that's I think part of the misconception tied to that, or a deeper misconception, is that there's any tie at all between wildland fire and structure fire, and in that case it depends a lot where you're trying to apply. If you work as an inmate in California and then like the day after you get out you want to work for San Diego Fire, you're going to have as hard a time as anyone trying to work for one of the most competitive departments in America. But if you want to go work in Minot, North Dakota, it might be a different situation.
Mhm. Any questions there? Yeah, I mean, I would personally, I like it was always awesome working with inmate firefighters, and actually on my helitech station, like we were literally 200 feet up the hill from an inmate fire camp. Like our helipad is here and the fire camp is down here. So yeah, like never a single problem that I heard of with inmate firefighters. So great
And
program in and of itself. Not saying anything about the criminal justice system in general.
for one piece of context on the length of shifts and the working conditions. And I don't know if anyone here was familiar with the military either, but for like the Army and the Marines, if you're going to like a forward combat job, generally the standard is that you're going to try to keep people like on the front line for less than 10 days for each of what you would consider a role. Granted, it's a little bit different, conditions if you're like in gunfights 20 hours a day, but it's the same thing if you go to a cop or a fob or whatever, you're usually not going to be fighting for your whole 10 days and then you're going to get switched out, versus a lot of these wildland firefighters, like you're working a full 16-hour day for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So it's I mean it's pretty tough on those guys.
But I think if there are no other questions, we can move on to the next case, which is again like kind of historical because there isn't a lot of new data on this. But
This one is probably pretty quick. It's a really
yeah,
interesting paper, but it's
yeah.
not as in depth.
So this paper was the Palmer perspective. It was written by a firefighter. It is like written in an academic fashion, but it's not like peer reviewed. And basically it was this, just to give you a quick and dirty, there was a tree strike on Andy Palmer, was the man who died, the firefighter, on the Shasta Trinity National Forest on the Iron Complex fire in 2008. And yeah, so he had a tree strike. He wasn't like pinned, or he was pinned shortly, but they got him freed pretty quickly. But he had a femoral artery injury, and basically the only, I think it was about an hour plus after the injury occurred that they finally got a like tourniquet on. When and that was well after paramedics arrived on scene as well. Basically they just used a shirt to try to like stop it. That was all that was used. And he ended up succumbing to his injuries after getting onto a helicopter, but before arriving at any sort of definitive care.
And to circle back to Dr. Curry's point earlier, this is a paper written in 2009 about events in 2008. This is very much shaped a lot of current practices and is in no way or very little way at that condemning of current practices. But I think you'll see that, as she mentioned earlier, a lot of his recommendations from the time have been met or are in the process of attempting to be met. But I also think it's interesting to note, as you look at his recommendations, that this was 2008 or 2009. And in the, as SOMA is going on right now, I think it's worth noting that the US military had already implemented almost all of these things that he's talking about in Iraq and Afghanistan years before this. So it's kind of interesting to see the lag in Fed Fire, even though it is still a federal agency.
Yeah, so about 15 years or so from this happening into Dr. Curry getting
it's
everything done.
Yeah, the Andy Palmer incident is really considered by most of us to have been the turning point to start the ball rolling, to do all these things we knew we should have been doing decades before. As I already put in the chat, we are, very, very young when it comes to the world of EMS. We are so woefully behind. It's for me, it's sometimes almost overwhelming how much still needs to be done. But things have happened, and Andy Palmer and his family are to be credited with that, and that is a legacy that they can be proud of, that things are happening. But yeah, at a totally different pace than the military. I totally agree.
And I think a lot of things with Wildland Fire is that it is incredibly grassroots. So a lot of these recommendations, there maybe now are requirements for them, or there still aren't requirements, but they have been met. And that's just because kind of each forest, each crew, each fire boss out there decided that they wanted to meet these requirements, which is kind of an awesome thing I think about the community. That's been true for a lot of different things in the community, but EMS is certainly one of them. So Robert Palmer wrote this paper after kind of this preventable death on the Iron Complex fire. A lot of it he was condemning like fire tactics, which have also changed. We'll get into that a little bit. But the US still is by far like the most aggressive in terms of stopping fires of like any international kind of picture. If you've ever fought fires in Canada, they watch them a lot more than we do. We tend to fight them. Australia is a little bit different. It's a lot heavier volunteer force, but again, we still have a lot more aggressive tactics, especially in forest fires specifically. And that was a lot of what led to this. He was like, why did we kind of spread out so much when we didn't have the resources to take care of our people? This was essentially preventable. So yeah, that golden hour, even as we looked at with the short haul response earlier, while like, yeah, the wildland fires fought in the middle of nowhere, humans still bleed out at the same rate out there.
So and a quick pause to mention Joe's comment as we're talking about people bleeding out there. Yeah, as Dr. Curry mentioned earlier, and we'll probably expand upon in a second, they've been improving the individual medical kits, and everyone that even before they did that now, in prior years, there was effectively like an IFAC light that anyone that was handling a saw or was teamed up with a saw would carry. It was basically a tourniquet and some gauze and like your favorite granola bar, but it was a tourniquet, and by the time that I started working there, and probably around the time that Kyle left, most of them you saw were cat tourniquets. Some people had soft teas, some people had stuff that they bought at Walmart, but it sounds like by now you're seeing mostly like solid tourniquets, and it sounds like everybody on the cruise getting them or will.
Yeah, crews have, their own individual budget for kind of the overall just fire suppression job, right? So supervisors for, I think, probably close to a decade now have not been, they haven't been like stingy with that in terms of spending on some decent medical equipment, and in almost all cases that I saw. And that was, 4 to 5 years ago. So yeah, not surprised if I would be surprised to find a crew in any professional federal crew that there wasn't like really good medical supplies available and usually on the scene now. But at the time of the Palmer incident, even the contracted paramedics did not have tourniquet, or they didn't even have, I think they had some abdominal pads. It was their bleeding control. And this was, there were already tourniquets in use. There are already quick clot, a lot of different, bleeding control mechanisms that just weren't available because the contractors, like Dr. Curry talked about, there are some really good ones. Personally worked with some really good ones, especially in aviation, but they're, sometimes corners are cut, certainly, which also happened on the Iron Complex fire. And another big thing, there was also an aviation incident on this fire because a contractor essentially falsified aircraft records, and I think 8 people died because of that. So yeah, the Palmer incident was followed by a lot of other things, but this was like the one people could point to be like, this, everything about this was wrong. So Robert Palmer wrote that at the time, 1 EMT per 499 employees was required. The geographic spread of those employees was never defined, so who knows what that means. You can have a multiple million acre fire, worked on a couple. So yeah, that's kind of useless. And that would, maybe a 1,000,000 acre fire has 800 to 1,000 firefighters, so 2 EMTs required. Not going to cut it, right? Whereas at the time, structure fire already had pretty much every single employee was an EMT. The military was, a lot of EMTs, even high school football, sadly had a lot better coverage. Well, not sadly, it's good, but a lot better coverage than Wildland Fire did at the time. And so we discussed non-fatal injuries earlier. So here's an NWCG report, or some stuff from an NWCG report on fatalities and fires and Wildland Fire. So total fatalities have gone up slightly over time. A lot of the big spikes, those are 5+ person, essentially like mass casualty events. I think I don't know if you can see it, but 2014, 15, whatever's the bigger one there. 2013 was like the Granite Mountain hot shots. So that was 19 people died at one time. So it's kind of hard to draw from that. Like there weren't a lot of medical things you could do with that. That's more of a tactics thing that Robert Palmer was talking about in terms of aggressive tactics.
You can also see, looking at this, like it's sad to talk about, but it is, when you look at it this way, it's easier to understand how it took so long to garner funding when you're having 3,000 people working, 2,000-hour seasons every summer, or 1,600-hour seasons, whatever. Like that is it's not it has recently been deemed an unacceptable number, but for a long time, from perhaps the federal government's perspective, it was, if you're averaging 10 people dying in a season out of however many man hours doing one of the more dangerous jobs in the country, and then you could assign 8 of those 10 to accidents. I think it's easy to understand how the government or anyone was able to justify not applying funding to that for a while.
And this represents all wildland firefighting in the US. This is not just federal. It was a federal report, but on all wildland firefighting. We'll get to it in a little bit, but less than 20% of these are federal firefighters, which is impressive due to the number of man hours they actually spend on the fire versus, I think, all others. So kind of here's the most recent data. So 170, and then there's the report.
What I like to emphasize on this one is when we get a lot of grief and pushback from our contracted medical assets about carrying a monitor, None of them want to carry a monitor. They don't want to they don't want to carry a monitor. And I'm like, "Oof, sorry, folks, but number one is still cardiac. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a
Oh, it's
super
huge.
interesting experience for me when I started working in the contract wildland medicine, because having come from the military into very briefly working with a hotshot crew, I was like, how could anybody, like, my perspective was similar, right? Why would we ever need a monitor? And then you're working with a bunch of people who were wildland firefighters or were, guides, patrollers, whatever, and everyone at the organization was similarly like not in agreement about using monitors, and then you sit down and someone puts the statistic in front of you and it's irrefutable. It's pretty wild though.
Yeah, and I think, if anyone's really good at electrical engineering, there aren't like pocket-size AEDs yet. That seems possible, considering there are pocket-sized like car jump starters at this point. So, I'm not going to be the one that can make that $1 million idea happen, but I'm sure if that was available, it'd probably be more used. We did have AEDs on the engine that I worked, and it's an AED on the helicopter was available, but we didn't fly with it unless we were going to a medical event, which was uncommon. I was there. BLS is pretty overwhelmingly available, or represented in the federal firefighting force itself. So monitors to us aren't that useful, but to the contractors and obviously anyone who's ALS should have a monitor. I think that's
Yeah.
not a
Well, and I
question
think
mark.
you're
It
right. I
shouldn't
think
be.
that time is coming, right? I mean, geez, just look at the Apple Watch and the
Mhm.
Cardia, and I mean, it's right around the corner that it'll be all out there. So, yeah.
Yeah, and
But
if you're doing emergency medicine and you're super passionate about those little pocket ultrasounds, go be a Lima and you can work to your heart's content with that, because nobody will stop you and no one else will have it.
And then, so here's a little bit earlier data. So not a lot of change, a few less deaths in 1990 to 1988, but not big changes in the percentages. Heart attacks have gone up a little bit, but as our next slide says, pie charts are a bit misleading. Burnovers have actually decreased over the period of that study. So that was interesting. That's kind of a tactics thing that Robert Palmer talked about. Like we actually have gotten less aggressive, I think. That's a sign of that. If the fire's not going over you, then you're probably fighting it a little bit smarter. Volunteer state and southern wildland firefighters were actually like the most susceptible to heart attack in terms of the breakdown, at least from 2017 to 2016. All of those are represented on any big fire. So you can only do so much with that. But I tend to think, and volunteers were pretty heavily represented with that. So I think that actually says we're doing a good job of screening out cardiac problems when we're doing our onboarding for federal wildland firefighters. So I take that as a good public health kind of win. The highest rates of burnovers were non-state, or sorry, that's a little bit confusing. So state firefighters and federal wildland firefighters have the lowest rates of burnovers. Everyone else, rural, volunteer, city, county, have the highest rates. So again, I think that's a good look at tactics, but also partially because those are often the first resources on scene when fire behavior is kind of the most unpredictable. Federal firefighters have by far the highest rate of death by aircraft accident. We spend the most time in aircraft. We have all the aircraft. That kind of makes sense. Ground vehicle accidents as well, which I think you could potentially contribute to the distances that we're driving to go to those roles. Like I said, it's a 14-day role, but you do have travel days at the end. I didn't talk about that. So you're going to have a full day to travel home, and you won't be able to drive more than 10 hours with like 2 different drivers. So it is limited, but when you're driving long distances, hotshot buggies put up huge numbers of miles every year. They get retired usually around like 300, 400,000 miles. And they get retired pretty frequently. Like these vehicles are being used a lot. So that's another one as a Lima. Like just if you're tired, like pull over, guys. Like don't get hurt on the way to or home from a fire. I tend to think this is fully anecdotal. I tend to think the way home is probably where most of those happen. Like you can drive with lights and sirens, but most people drive. You actually aren't like allowed to drive over the speed limit per like Forest Service regulations from when I was there. So you're generally driving pretty safely towards the fire. As you know, the classic adage of like you can't like don't become the victim kind of thing. I think people generally do a good job of that. And then by far, federal have the highest rate of death by falling rocks and trees, and that is because of the use of chainsaws, as well as like being the ones that are far out on the fire in the middle of nowhere, where those hazards are just the most common. You're rarely going to be doing kind of the wildland urban interface protection or structure protection stuff that Dr. Curry talked about. Usually they're going to use whatever local resources or state resources are available to do that, and you're going to be, as the federal firefighter, far out on the fire, which does lead to a lot of kind of, as you can see, a lot of fatalities. As we saw up higher in the first one we went over, the first article, those weren't generally reported, I don't think, at a very high rate compared to the rates of fatalities. So that's another one. Like, you know, if you have a small rock hit you, I certainly had rocks roll into my shins, like, and never reported that, but didn't get run over by a boulder either. So people are well aware of those hazards, but they're out there, and they're probably pretty underreported. And then, like I said, only 18% of the overall fatalities were federal, 17% of the overall were state. So as a whole, like for the number of man hours that federal and state resources are putting on the wildland fires, they're being pretty safe, I believe, like you would think, compared to kind of the number of hours spent by other wildland firefighting resources. Like I said, the Forest Services was the biggest firefighting agency in the world, and I think it still is. So, yeah. Getting back to the recommendations kind of from that Palmer perspective paper, requiring the arduous duty fitness requirements for EMTBs, that is required, as far as I know, with almost all like contractors that are fire line medics to be an EMTF, or I think it's AEMF or EMPF. You have to pass the arduous fitness. Same with the REMS and RATS crews. And the arduous fitness is essentially like an occupational health screening plus a 45-minute 3-mile jog walk with a 45-pound pack. So on flat ground. It's not, you know, the hardest thing ever, but you'll be sweating and breathing pretty hard. So requiring all EMTs to be qualified at the firefighter 2 level. I don't think that's definitely the 2 field assignments before being an EMT. That does happen if you're a federally employed like firefighter. That does not happen if you're a contractor, I don't think. Not in my experience. And then 1 field EMT per 10 line personnel. I think this is pretty much been reached. Dr. Curry, you said you quoted a number of EMTs that you had. So
it's yeah, I mean, there's agency and there's non-agency. I will say on an incident, yeah, we meet that ratio and then some. I think it's actually even higher on an incident, between cooperators, contractors, federals, embedded, single resource, local. Yeah, we're pretty good on making that ratio.
yeah, and that was definitely my experience in 2019, 2020. In California, I think it's probably a little bit higher.
Yeah, I think it's higher across the country. I mean, all the incidents I was out on a couple summers ago, I mean, you couldn't turn around without hitting an EMT. They were everywhere.
Yeah, and
which is good.
Yeah, it's great. Compared to the time of the Palmer incident, definitely we have, I think we've met and exceeded a lot of these things that he wanted. And crews actually do like just organic medical training. Like I said, it's very grassroots. I think there's some required, or at least there was always like a forest required medical training we did at the start of the year. But when we had time, any sort of downtime, which there isn't necessarily a lot of, we would do like our own little medical scenarios and everything.
So the agency used to require fieldwork life-saving, which was a Forest Service homegrown course that everybody who works in the field for the agency, whether you're a timber marker or a wildlife biologist or a firefighter, has to take fieldwork lifesaver or the equivalent. And it's basically pretty similar to a wilderness first aid or even woofer type curriculum. So
Yeah, and kind of something we found like in the paper that I know I talked about that we were writing. The BLM has like their operational medical support program, which you talked about a little bit too, Dr. Curry. And that's like essentially they're only taking, I think, nationally registered EMRs, EMTs, AEMTs, and paramedics, and they're adding some wilderness skills like resetting dislocations, use of vials of epinephrine. I think that's more of just a EpiPen shortage kind of thing, but also economically makes sense. And a couple other small like wilderness specific skills to get rated as an actual OMSP provider. So that's a pretty awesome program that they have going.
yeah, and the Forest Service protocols and procedures, which I didn't share the QR code, but I can next time we have a chat, is now you can download that onto a government or a civilian device, and we've got all the robust remote and austere medical care. So dislocation management, epi drop is a couple things as well. So yeah, there's some things that Dr. Southard and I definitely have mirrored in each other's protocols.
Awesome. And I think that's all we had there. Yeah. So any questions from anyone? I'm just checking the chat now.
Chat's actually pretty cleared up. Any questions after they just finished their talk there?
Well, I would love to hear what other areas. It sounds like there's been some positive changes, but still, need room for improvements. What propositions from the Palmer article, or just in your experience, would you say are areas that have the most room for improvement, should be targeted?
Well, if you wait a couple months, our paper will come out. But hopefully, so keep an eye out in the Wilderness Medicine Journal. But Dr. Curry, if you want to go first, please.
Well, I mean, I think we've still got a long way to go on some of these things. Like I said, I sometimes get discouraged with the mountain we have to climb, but then I look back and I'm like, shit, we've come up a few thousand feet. We can do this. So yeah, I still think we have a long way to go for us in the Forest Service, just getting the word out that there's now a formal program and that you have to be credentialed to be able to provide care. You can't just be a hotshot out there anymore and your hotshot soup says you're the EMT and you're now responsible for medical care. And that's what we used to do, right? And talk about completely unfair to the poor EMT and to the crew. They're like, okay, now I have to provide medical care. I've got no backup. I've got nobody having my back if something goes wrong. I got no medical oversight. I got no doc. I got no protocols. I've got a boo-boo box. Great, I feel real good. So so we're still working hard to get the word out to. There are still, I mean, I was in California this winter and did a whole lot of politicking there, because when I came on with the agency 2 years ago, everybody told me, oh yeah, California's all set, they've already done all this. And so I put them at the bottom of my list, right? I got 50 states and 5 territories to worry about. California's all set, I'm going to let them be all set. And then went out to California this winter and had the eye-opening experience of, oh, heck no. Well, they've done great things, as these guys have pointed out, but it's been that grassroots ground level up thing, which is wonderful. And that's how we get places in this agency. but now we need to support it from the top down. I'm also a big advocate on the mental health well-being picture for our EMS folks and our firefighters both, and our EMS firefighters. So Stress First Aid is another grassroots effort within the agency that I absolutely support and endorse. I'm the Train the Trainer. I'm a coach. I'll go out and teach it all the time. I was just in Puerto Rico teaching stress of first aid to the El Yunque. And so I think we have a long way to go on that. I think we have a long way to go. We need to get EMTs into our position descriptions. It needs to be the job. It can't be the collateral duty. If it's the collateral duty, you're never going to get the right people. So it needs to be the job. It needs to be in the position description. It needs to be recognized. The equipment needs to be bought, and the training needs to be paid for. And for us, training is super important, because here's the key piece in our agency for EMS. Contractors are different, right? But for us on the Fed side, our patient contacts are extremely few, right? If you're an EMS provider in the wildland fire environment working for a federal agency, you may only treat 1 or 2 patients a year. All right. How hard is it to keep your skills and your knowledge up? And oh, by the way, those 1 or 2 you treat a year, they could have taken a chainsaw to the leg or a tree to the head or been in a burnover. These aren't, so it's low incidence, high consequence medicine for people who don't get that everyday experience. So not only do they not get the skills and the hands-on training, they also don't get that mental resiliency that we all in the emergency medicine business get, because, for me, 30 years in the ER, yeah, I still get sad when a patient dies, but I sleep at night. A young wildland firefighter EMT who's now taking care of his buddy who's died, that's a whole different scenario. So yeah, that's just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's probably about 1 million more.
Yeah, and a couple of the core thoughts that we kind of talked through, which echo a lot of what you said, Dr. Curry, is kind of currency, compensation, and recruitment. Currency at the EMT level, right? Like she said, if you see 2 patients a year and they're both like 19-year-old ultra fit, ultra marathoners, you're looking at a unique patient population. If you are not, if you're working as a seasonal employee, which most people are, then you're not being either paid or trained to maintain your competencies. So then it's kind of on you to find an EMS agency that will let you work during the slower months of the year, where you're going to work as a guide, or you're going to go work as a patroller somewhere like Kyle and a lot of other people did. And then you're going to go there and see the same different mechanism of injury, where you see 100 people that fell over their handlebars, or you see, some 80-year-old French guy that got drunk and crashed on a ski slope, whatever. It's tough to maintain your currency there. Compensation is a big issue. It's, you're talking about adding it as a full-time duty, which kind of lends to that, but it's kind of tough. Like on our crew that I was on briefly, we had 3 or 4 people that were EMTs that really had no interest in becoming AEMTs or paramedics, because they didn't feel that the Bureau of Land Management would support them in doing that, which has been addressed in some places. And it sounds like you guys are trying to address it right now, Dr. Curry, but like Alaska has addressed it a little bit. The BLM has. If you guys want to talk to someone that has some really interesting perspectives, the guys that run the Park Medic program are cool. And that leads into my kind of last point, is recruitment. If your people are not maintaining their currency and they're not being compensated, it is very hard to recruit people to do it. And there are a few pools of like really excellent people that would love to, that Kyle and I have addressed with some of the people at USIS and some of the national disaster stuff. Like there's a pretty logical pipeline from like military medics into this job. There's a pretty natural pipeline for your prisoners, like we were talking about. And some other places, young rural EMS, where it's a tough, as you guys many of you have studied up to this point in your medical careers. I'm sure you've seen some of the pitfalls of rural EMS. This could be a really attractive career for some of those guys and gals. And it's also, and this is no fault of the Forest Service at all, but it's like we talked about with the Park Medic guys, it's a lot sexier for them, because you have people falling into the Grand Canyon, and you have people, you have all the demographics really, you have 20 people from China that don't speak English that come and get lost in the desert. You have a lot of interesting stuff. People messing with buffalo in the Tetons. But then when you look at the wildland fire population, you have your one-off contractor that has a heart attack, and then a bunch of ultra healthy 20-year-olds that don't want to tell you that they cut their toe off. So
Yeah, and
it's
kind of going on that, like, yeah, there is no extra pay if you're an EMT and firefighter. You, like Dr. Curry said, you're hired to be a firefighter as it stands right now. There are a couple jobs now where that EMT is required, but to address Matthew's thing, so I can tell you, I worked in areas where there were no other professional firefighters in the county. So we were the first responders. There were professional EMTs, but we could get there faster a lot of the time, and then especially if they were on forest. So I responded to a lot more non-firefighter medical things than firefighter medical things. So that was part of you know, like keeping your skills up. You just have to study a lot, and honestly, you're gonna have skill atrophy if you're going from any sort of like actual EMS job to firefighting. And one of the things that we've kind of thought of to address it, and this would be like an NWCG thing. Like Dr. Curry said, the seasonal workforce, I was a temp seasonal, and that's just how it was. But yeah, like I said, a lot of these places that we have professional wildland firefighters are places where there isn't professional EMS. So kind of it's a very forest by forest thing. Like the forest north of us, if you came to their station with a heart attack, like an obvious heart attack going on, you would have gotten turned away to the volunteer fire station. Whereas we had AEDs and we would have happily tried our best to treat you, working essentially under Good Samaritan laws, but we would have tried our best. So that's kind of forest by forest, I think, still. And then at a national level, like we said with the ICS, all of these firefighters are intimately familiar with the ICS system. They'd be really good at responding to natural disasters that aren't fires and just being medical personnel on those. So I think this is really also an untapped kind of national pool to draw from for kind of medical surge capacity for things like, you know, Katrina or whatever big natural disasters where you need some other medical providers, or, you know, just to give shots with COVID or anything like that. Like these people weren't utilized for that, but I think they could be. The better we actually like kind of register them with the Forest Service and track where they are and be like, oh, you have this extra skill set. So yeah, no, definitely no,
It is
no
definitely
money involved. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's definitely been a forest by forest process for me. And so that's a little bit of the negativeness of our organization is, yes, it's really cool. We have these grassroots things, but because of that, it's a forest by forest process. So good stuff is coming from the bottom up. We need good stuff to come from the top down, and we need to meet in the middle. And what I'm hoping now is, since that we've now got an EMS program at the top, we're trying to get down there and meet with the people and figure out, what have you guys been doing that's working great? What have you been doing that's not working great? Where does the help need to be? And every one of my road trips, I learned something, every single one, which is why I keep doing it. So I think eventually we'll get there. And as far as DMAT teams, so I've been on a DMAT team for 14 years, been on lots of these disaster assignments. And when I came to the Forest Service, I was told I couldn't be on a DMAT team anymore because you can't work for two federal agencies at the same time. So I agree with you, Kyle. That seems stupid to me. We've got all these EMTs. When something goes down, why can't we send a few of them out on assignment? And it has to do with ESF 8 versus ESF 4. And for those of you in the ICS world, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because we're under two different federal response structures, it's politics is the bottom line.
But yeah, I know hotshot crews will go out to like clear roads after disasters.
They will, and
yeah.
we did have a few teams, Forest Service EMTs, who did COVID immunizations. They did participate in some of those COVID shot things on a weird thing. And then of course you can always do DASP, which I haven't quite figured that one out yet. I'm in the process of figuring that one out, which is the disaster response thing within the agency.
There are some unique instances with particularly like smoke jumpers that are very tempting to sight, but they're also like a completely different flavor of degenerate than even the rest of the wildland fire community. And they also have, depending on how you look at it, a little bit more permanence, and they also have the predictability of a very short career. So like permanence is relative, but a lot of them prioritize a lot of that within their crew because they look at it a little bit more militaristically than some places do. They're like, we're, even if you watch their like tryouts and selection, it looks a lot more like some of the capital S selections. And because of that, they take that upon themselves. But it's hard to cite that against other things because their funding, similar to any like special operation, is very different than everyone else's, and also they're just a certain amount of like pride and prioritization.
It's that one is a tough group to break into for me. But I have made ground with two different smoke jumper groups, so I'm getting there. Yeah, it's a culture for sure.
They're also uniquely like education heavy. Like a lot of smoke jumpers become nurses and doctors, in no small part because they're, with a little bit more longevity, their crews are able to support that. Something Kyle and I have talked about as the fire season has gotten longer, the like education in wildland fire structure has changed a lot. So if you're not in California on the quarter system, it's hard to go to school at all and do fire, which has really changed, I think, a lot of the additional duties people are willing to take on as your population changes to almost exclusively like transient young people. Yeah, any more questions?
Oh, shoot, I was muted. I'm sorry. It looks like Joe had just put in a comment a couple of minutes ago about HHS DMAT teams, unless you think we've covered that.
Dr. Curry addressed that a little bit.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think we've covered that, but there, so California does, stop me if I'm wrong, California peeps. They will use the CalMAT, the California Medical Assistance Teams on a fire, which is a state medical assistance team. So most states have a state team in addition to a federal team. There had been talk when I was working my fairly high up within HHS about possibly using DMATs on large wildland fire incidents. And I think if we had a long PL5 season and we were tapped out, it could be done. But DMATs requires Stafford Act declaration, and that gets even more complicated. And then we didn't even talk about when we send our crews up to Canada. That's a whole other lecture.
There's also like a confusing relationship with the public health service in federal fire. Like the BLM's medical director is a public health service officer. And then some people are and aren't. It sounds to me, this is just an opinion, this is not based on research at all, that it was at one point either a failed attempt to merge the public health service or like a slow roll into using them in Fed fire. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Dr. Curry.
So Drew Southard was doing fire for a long time as an aside with the BLM. And when they approached him with the national directorship program, they decided to go the PHS route. So that's when he joined PHS, was basically he joined PHS so he could get the BLM job. So BLM, of course, is part of DOI. DOI used to have a national medical director who did NPS. That was Michael Handrigan. And when Forest Service started, we were under him as well because we were that joint program for a few years. And so that was a PHS officer that DOI used because they've used him before. My understanding was for a lot of reasons, the joint program was not successful completely. There were some great things that came out of it, but in the end, we all parted ways. And so the Forest Service decided instead of going the PHS route, they would hire a medical director to be an employee of the agency. And that's me. The upshot, the good news is that means I'm in the green, I'm in the pickle suit. And I do the pickle suit things. And and I don't have to do the PHS things. The bad news is, of course, I don't know if they'll be successful after I retire, which could be tomorrow at this rate. In getting another person because the pay scale is so completely different. I think we are hiring some PHS officers within the agency to do some other things. So behavioral health is one, and we're looking at getting some industrial hygienists on to help us with the new occupational health rules that we were hinting about, preventing cancers and all that other stuff. So I think in the future, you'll see a few more PHS folks within the agency.
Well, we have reached the 2 hour mark, which is actually quite indicative of our interactive participant questions here, because we usually end a little earlier. There's been a lot of questions. Any last minute questions or comments from participants, speakers?
We've overwhelmed everybody with fire, and we're sorry we went over, but
No,
thank you.
that is great. I've been keeping an eye on participation, and it's actually stayed pretty steady, showing how engaged people have been. If anybody has any other questions, I'm otherwise going to end recording. Anybody can ask other questions outside of the recording, but at this time, thanks for joining. I'll see you next month on June 19th for Global Health. We have a couple speakers who do a lot of work in Africa who are going to be joining and talk about their experiences. I'll see you next month. And otherwise, if you stay in the chat, happy to chat some more.